What happens when airport staff stop an elderly veteran escorting a fallen soldier? The moment a pilot steps in, everything changes in a way no one saw coming. The late afternoon sun hung low over Richmond International Airport in Virginia, painting the tarmac in hues of amber and gold. The air was thick with the scent of jet fuel and the distant rumble of engines, a symphony of departure and arrival that pulsed through the terminal. At Gate 12, amidst the flurry of travelers dragging suitcases and checking phones, stood Vernon Haskins, a 78-year-old Vietnam War veteran and tomb guard from Arlington National Cemetery. His military uniform, pressed to perfection, bore the faint creases of time, its brass buttons catching the light like tiny beacons. His silver hair was neatly combed, his face etched with lines that told stories of jungles, sacrifice, and silent vigils over white headstones. Under his arm he carried a folded American flag, its edges worn but pristine, a sacred relic of his duty to escort the remains of Private First Class Jamal Thornton, a young soldier killed in a stateside training accident just 8 days prior. Vernon's steps were measured, his limp, a souvenir from a shrapnel wound in '68, barely noticeable to the untrained eye. He moved through the crowd with the quiet dignity of a man who'd spent decades honoring the fallen, his eyes scanning the gate area for the airline staff who would guide him to the cargo hold. His heart was heavy, not just with the weight of his task, but with the memory of every casket he'd escorted, every family he'd stood beside. Jamal, just 22, had dreamed of flying helicopters, a dream cut short before it could take wing. Vernon's job was to ensure the boy's final journey was marked with the respect he deserved, a mission that felt more sacred with each passing year. He approached the check-in counter, where a young woman in a navy blue airline uniform stood hunched over a computer, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with mechanical precision. Her name tag read Kendra Willis, Gate Agent. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her expression suggested she was already halfway through a long shift. Vernon cleared his throat, his voice steady but warm, like a grandfather addressing a grandchild. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. "I'm here to escort Private Thornton's remains. I was told to check in at this gate for Flight 472 to Atlanta." Kendra's eyes flicked up briefly, barely registering the man in front of her. She glanced at his uniform, her gaze lingering on the medals pinned to his chest, then returned to her screen. "Name?" she asked, her tone as flat as the linoleum floor beneath them. "Vernon Haskins, ma'am," he replied, his hands clasped behind his back. "I'm with the Arlington Honor Guard. I have orders from the Army liaison." Kendra's fingers paused, and she sighed, a sound that carried the weight of a dozen minor annoyances. "I don't have anything about an escort on my manifest," she said, her voice tinged with impatience. "You sure you're at the right gate? This is a busy flight, and I've got a lot to handle." Vernon's brow furrowed, but his composure held firm, a steel forged in years of discipline. "Yes, ma'am. Gate 12, Flight 472. I confirmed with the liaison this morning. If there's a mix-up, I'd be happy to wait while you check." Kendra's lips pursed, and she pushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear, her movements sharp. "Wait? Sir, I've got 200 passengers to board in less than 20 minutes, and I don't have time to play detective. Do you have ID or official orders?" Vernon reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against the worn leather of his wallet. He produced a folded letter from the Department of the Army, its edges creased from careful handling, and his military ID, which bore a younger version of his face, stern but proud. He placed them on the counter with a gentleness that contrasted with the chaos around him. "Here you are, ma'am," he said, his voice calm but resolute. Kendra snatched the documents, her eyes scanning them with a cursory glance before shoving them back toward him. "This doesn't help," she said, her tone sharper now. "These are Army papers. I need something from the airline. You can't just show up and expect to waltz into restricted areas." Vernon's jaw tightened, a flicker of frustration passing through his weathered features. He'd faced bureaucracy before, faceless clerks, endless forms, people who saw rules as walls rather than bridges. But this was different. This was about a boy who'd never see his mother again. A boy whose name deserved to be spoken with reverence. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made the air feel heavier. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to make sure a fallen soldier is treated with the dignity he earned. If you need to make a call, I'll stand right here until it's sorted." Kendra's eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, her voice rising just enough to draw attention from nearby passengers. "Sir, I'm telling you, you're not on my list. Step aside, please. You're holding up my line." The words cut deeper than Vernon expected. He'd stood through monsoons at Arlington, his boots soaked, his hands numb, guarding the unknowns. He'd faced gunfire in jungles where the air tasted of fear. But this casual dismissal in a crowded airport, surrounded by people too busy to care, felt like a betrayal of everything he'd fought for. He took a slow breath, his eyes locking onto Kendra's, searching for a flicker of understanding. There was none. Only impatience and a hint of disdain. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "This isn't about me. It's about a young man who gave everything for this country. I'm just asking you to do your part." Kendra's face hardened, and she waved a hand dismissively. "I'm doing my job, sir. Now move, or I'll call security." The threat landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the gate area. A few passengers turned, their curiosity piqued. A man in a gray business suit, briefcase in hand, muttered to his companion, "Great, another delay." A woman with a toddler on her hip shot Vernon a look of irritation, as if he were the cause of her missed connection. Vernon felt their stares, a weight as heavy as the flag under his arm, but he didn't flinch. He'd faced worse than this, and he'd be damned if he let a gate agent's bad day stop him from doing right by Jamal. Before he could respond, a security officer approached, his broad shoulders filling the space. His name tag read Darius Coleman, Airport Security. He was in his early 30s, with a no-nonsense air and a radio clipped to his belt. "Is there a problem here?" Darius asked, his eyes moving between Vernon and Kendra. "This guy says he's some kind of military escort, but he's not on the manifest," Kendra said, folding her arms. "He's slowing everything down, and I've got a flight to board." Darius turned to Vernon, his expression neutral but firm. "Sir, can you explain what's going on?" Vernon repeated his story, his voice steady as he recounted his role, the flight number, and Private Thornton's name. He handed over the same documents, his hand steady despite the growing tension. Darius skimmed them, his frown deepening. "Mr. Haskins, I see the Army letter, but if the airline doesn't have you listed, I can't let you through. You understand that, right?" "I understand rules, son," Vernon said, his tone carrying the weight of a man who'd lived through too many battles to be swayed by protocol. "But this isn't about rules. It's about a soldier who deserves better than being treated like baggage." Darius shifted, his radio crackling with static. He glanced at the crowd, now openly watching, their phones out, capturing the scene. "Sir, I'm sorry, but I need you to step over here with me. Let's sort this out away from the counter." Vernon followed, his limp more pronounced now, each step a reminder of the shrapnel still buried in his hip. The crowd parted, their whispers following him like a shadow. A teenage girl with braided hair and a backpack, Aaliyah Brooks, watched from a nearby seat, her eyes wide with curiosity. She'd been traveling to Atlanta to visit her grandmother, but something about Vernon, his quiet strength, the flag under his arm, drew her in. As Vernon sat down near the gate, Aaliyah approached, her voice soft but earnest. "Sir, are you really a soldier?" she asked, clutching her backpack straps. Vernon looked at her, his expression softening, the lines on his face easing for a moment. "Was, young lady," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "A long time ago. Now I just try to do right by those who still serve." Aaliyah sat beside him, her curiosity outweighing her shyness. "That flag," she said, pointing to the cloth under his arm. "Is it for someone special?" "It's for a soldier," Vernon said, his voice low, almost reverent. "A young man named Jamal Thornton. He didn't make it home, and I'm here to make sure his family knows he was honored." Aaliyah's eyes widened, and she leaned closer. "That's That's really important. Why won't they let you do it?" Vernon chuckled softly, a sound tinged with the irony of a man who'd seen the world's indifference too many times. "Folks get busy, kid. They forget what matters when they're chasing their own schedules." As the boarding process began, Kendra's voice crackled over the intercom, calling for first-class passengers. Vernon watched her, his eyes narrowing slightly. He'd seen her type before, people who hid behind rules because it was easier than caring. He leaned back in his seat, the flag still in his grasp, and thought of Arlington, of the endless rows of headstones, of the soldiers he'd buried and the ones he'd failed to save. Jamal Thornton deserved better than this, and Vernon wasn't about to let him down. The gate area at Richmond International Airport had thinned out, the frenetic energy of boarding giving way to an uneasy quiet. The late afternoon light filtered through the terminal's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the rows of empty seats. Vernon Haskins stood at the check-in counter, his weathered hands resting lightly on the polished surface, the folded American flag tucked securely under his arm. The flag's edges, frayed from years of service, brushed against the crisp fabric of his Arlington Honor Guard uniform, a silent reminder of his duty to escort Private Jamal Thornton's remains to Atlanta. His silver hair gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights, and his face, etched with decades of loss and resolve, held a quiet strength that seemed to anchor the chaos around him. Randall Pierce, the new gate agent who'd replaced Kendra Willis, was on the phone, his brow furrowed as he spoke in hushed tones to a supervisor. Vernon watched him closely, his sharp blue eyes searching for any sign of progress. The weight of his mission pressed harder with each passing minute, a burden he carried not just for Jamal, but for every soldier he'd honored in his 30 years as a tomb guard. His limp, a lingering echo of a shrapnel wound from Vietnam, ached in the cold air of the terminal. But he stood tall, his posture a testament to a life spent in service. Randall hung up the phone and turned to Vernon, his expression a mix of apology and frustration. "Mr. Haskins," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "I spoke to my supervisor, and there's no record of an escort authorization for Flight 472. I'm sorry, but without that I can't let you into the cargo area. It's airline policy." Vernon's lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers tightening briefly around the flag. He'd heard this song before, bureaucracy's favorite tune, played on repeat to drown out the human cost. "Son," he said, his voice low but resonant like a distant roll of thunder, "I've been escorting fallen soldiers since before you were born. I've stood in mud and rain to honor men whose names never made the news. This isn't about policy. It's about a boy who deserves to go home right." Randall shifted, his eyes darting to the computer screen as if it might offer salvation. "I get it, sir." "I do," he said, his tone softer now, almost pleading. "But my hands are tied. Maybe if you head to the airline's main office down by Terminal B, they can sort this out." Vernon's gaze didn't waver, his eyes locking onto Randall's with the weight of a man who'd seen too much to be swayed by excuses. "Terminal B," he repeated, a faint wry smile tugging at his lips. "You ever try walking a mile with a piece of shrapnel in your hip, son? I'm not here to chase paper trails. I'm here for Private Thornton." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. But before Randall could respond, Kendra Willis stormed back into the gate area, her coffee cup clutched like a lifeline. Her navy blue uniform was slightly wrinkled now, her bun looser, as if her frustration had begun to unravel her composure. She spotted Vernon and stopped short, her eyes narrowing. "You're still here?" she said, her voice slicing through the quiet like a blade. "I told you, you're not on the list. You're holding up my entire operation." Vernon turned to face her, his posture unwavering. "Your operation, ma'am?" he said, his tone calm but laced with a dry irony that only comes with age. "Last I checked, your operation was getting folks to Atlanta. Mine's making sure a soldier gets the respect he earned. Seems to me one of us is doing their job." Kendra's face flushed, and she stepped closer, her voice rising to a pitch that drew every eye in the gate area. "Don't lecture me, old man," she snapped. I've got a plane to board, and you're not special just because you're wearing some dusty uniform. Step aside, or I'm calling security again." The words landed like a slap, and for a moment, Vernon's breath caught in his chest. He'd faced worse: mortars in Da Nang, the screams of wounded men, the endless silence of Arlington's headstones. But this public dismissal in a fluorescent-lit airport stung in a way that cut deeper than shrapnel. He felt the eyes of the crowd, now growing, their phones raised like silent judges. A man in a polo shirt, balancing a laptop bag, whispered to his wife, "What's his deal?" A young mother, her toddler tugging at her sleeve, shot Vernon a look of exasperation, as if he were the sole cause of her delayed flight. Aaliyah Brooks, the teenage girl who'd spoken to Vernon earlier, was still seated nearby, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She stood up, her braided hair swaying as she stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "Why are you being so rude to him?" she asked Kendra, her brown eyes flashing with indignation. "He's a veteran. He's here for a soldier who died. Show some respect." Kendra turned, her gaze sharp enough to cut glass. "Kid, stay out of this," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "This is adult business. Go sit down." Aaliyah's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground, her hands balling into fists. "It is my business," she shot back. "My dad was in the army. I know what it means to lose someone. You don't get to talk to him like that." The gate area grew electric, the tension crackling like static before a storm. A middle-aged woman, Marla Hensley, rose from her seat, her phone still in hand, her face a mix of outrage and disbelief. She'd been quietly recording the exchange, her thumb hovering over the screen. "Excuse me," Marla said, her voice steady but sharp. "Is there a reason you're treating this man like he's some kind of nuisance? He's in a military uniform, for God's sake. Have some decency." Kendra's face reddened further, but she doubled down, her arms crossing tightly over her chest. "I'm doing my job, ma'am," she said, her voice now a near shout. "This guy doesn't have clearance, and I'm not risking my position because he thinks he's above the rules." "Above the rules?" Vernon said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade through silk. He took a step closer, his limp barely noticeable now, his presence commanding despite his age. "Ma'am, I've spent my life following rules. Rules that kept men alive. Rules that honored the dead. You think your clipboard's more important than a soldier's sacrifice?" The crowd gasped audibly, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the air from the room. Kendra faltered, her bravado cracking for a split second, but she recovered quickly, her jaw tightening. "Don't twist this," she said. "You're the one causing a scene." Before Vernon could respond, Darius Coleman, the security officer, returned, his radio crackling with updates. His broad shoulders filled the space, and his expression was one of strained patience. "All right, folks, let's calm this down," he said, his voice authoritative but weary. "Mr. Haskins, I need you to come with me to the security office. We'll figure this out there." Vernon shook his head, his hands clasped behind his back, the flag still secure. "I'm not going anywhere until I know Private Thornton's casket is being handled with respect," he said, his tone unwavering, each word deliberate. "You can drag me out in cuffs if you want, son, but I've stood for hours in worse conditions than this to honor men like him." Darius's eyes flickered with uncertainty, his hand hovering over his radio. The crowd was now fully invested, their murmurs growing louder. Aaliyah stepped closer to Vernon, her small frame a quiet show of solidarity. Marla, still recording, muttered under her breath, "This is outrageous. They're treating him like a criminal." Vernon's gaze swept over the scene, the impatient gate agent, the stoic security officer, the curious onlookers. He thought of Jamal Thornton, a kid who'd wanted to soar above the clouds, now reduced to a line item on a manifest. He thought of his own years in the jungle, the friends he'd lost, the promises he'd made to never let a soldier be forgotten. "I've seen folks hide behind rules before," he said, his voice low but resonant, a faint smile touching his lips. "They think it protects them. But it doesn't. It just makes you forget what you're here for." The gate area fell silent, his words settling over the crowd like a weight. Even Kendra seemed momentarily unsure, her coffee cup forgotten on the counter. But Darius, bound by protocol, stepped closer, his voice firm. "Sir, I'm giving you one last chance to come with me voluntarily. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The threat hung in the air, and the crowd held its breath. Aaliyah's eyes widened, and she reached out, her hand brushing Vernon's sleeve. "Don't let them do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Before Vernon could respond, a new voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. "What in the name of all that's holy is going on here?" The speaker was Captain Terrence Vaughn, a pilot in his late 40s, his uniform pristine, his cap tucked under his arm. His dark eyes scanned the scene, taking in Vernon's uniform, the flag, and the tense standoff. He'd just finished his pre-flight checks and was heading to the gate when he'd heard the commotion. His presence was like a storm rolling in, calm but undeniable. "Captain," Kendra said, her tone shifting to one of nervous deference, "this man claims he's an escort for some cargo, but he's not on the manifest. We're handling it." Terrence's gaze settled on Vernon, and something in his expression softened, a flicker of recognition passing through his eyes. "You're with Arlington, aren't you?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. Vernon nodded, his posture unwavering. "Yes, sir. Vernon Haskins, Tomb Guard. I'm here to escort Private Jamal Thornton's remains to Atlanta." Terrence's jaw tightened, and he turned to Kendra, his voice low but laced with steel. "And why exactly is this man standing here instead of being escorted to the cargo hold?" Kendra stammered, her confidence crumbling. He doesn't have the right paperwork, sir. I checked the manifest." "Did you call the cargo supervisor?" Terrence interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "Did you contact the Army liaison? Or did you just decide this wasn't your problem?" Kendra's face flushed, and she glanced at Darius for support, but the security officer looked away, suddenly fascinated by his radio. Terrence stepped closer to Vernon, his voice softening. "Mr. Haskins, I'm sorry for this mess. I'll take you to the cargo hold myself." Vernon nodded, his expression unreadable but grateful. "Thank you, Captain." As Terrence led Vernon away, the crowd erupted into murmurs, their phones still recording. Aaliyah clapped her hands, a grin breaking across her face, while Marla lowered her phone, her eyes bright with emotion. Kendra stood frozen, her coffee forgotten, the weight of her mistake settling over her like a shadow. But the ordeal wasn't over. As Vernon and Terrence approached the restricted area, a new figure emerged from the shadows of the cargo bay entrance, a supervisor named Lester Gaines, a burly man with a clipboard and a scowl that could curdle milk. "Hold up," Lester said, blocking their path, his voice gruff. "No one told me about an escort. I need authorization." Terrence's patience snapped, his voice rising just enough to echo in the narrow corridor. "You've got a fallen soldier in your cargo hold, and this man is here to honor him. Get out of the way, or you'll be explaining this to the base commander." Lester hesitated, his eyes flicking between Terrence and Vernon, his clipboard suddenly feeling inadequate. Vernon said nothing, his focus unwavering, the flag in his grasp a silent rebuke. As they moved past Lester, Vernon's thoughts drifted to Jamal, to the boy's mother waiting in Atlanta, to the promises he'd made to never let a soldier's sacrifice be forgotten. The cargo hold of Richmond International Airport was a cavernous, shadowed space, its air thick with the metallic tang of machinery and the faint hum of cooling units. The concrete floor echoed with each step as Vernon Haskins followed Captain Terrence Vaughn down a narrow corridor, their silhouettes stark against the flickering fluorescent lights. Vernon's limp, a stubborn reminder of a shrapnel wound from Vietnam, sent a dull ache through his hip, but he moved with unwavering purpose, the folded American flag clutched tightly under his arm. Its worn edges brushed against his uniform, a silent vow to Private Jamal Thornton, the young soldier whose casket awaited in the loading bay. Behind them, Lester Gaines, the cargo supervisor, trailed reluctantly, his clipboard gripped like a shield, his earlier bravado reduced to a sullen shuffle. The loading bay opened before them, a vast space cluttered with crates and pallets, but Vernon's eyes found the casket immediately. It rested on a metal platform, draped in a plain gray cover that did little to honor the life it contained. Jamal Thornton, barely 22, had died in a training accident, his dreams of flying helicopters grounded forever. The sight of the casket hit Vernon like a tide, pulling him back to the jungles of '68, to the faces of friends lost, to the endless rows of white headstones at Arlington. He stepped forward, his hand brushing the edge of the casket, the cold metal grounding him in the moment. He bowed his head, a silent prayer forming in his chest, not for himself, but for the boy who'd never see his mother again. Terrence stood beside him, his pilot's cap now in his hands, his dark eyes reflecting a shared understanding. "Mr. Haskins," he said, his voice low and steady, "I'm sorry you had to fight for this." "No one should have made this harder than it already is." Vernon nodded, his throat tight with emotion he'd long learned to keep at bay. "It's not about me, Captain," he said, his voice rough but resolute. "It's about him. Jamal deserved better than being treated like just another piece of cargo." Lester, lingering a few feet away, shifted uncomfortably, his clipboard now a useless prop. "Look, I didn't know it was a soldier," he muttered, his voice defensive but tinged with shame. "We handle hundreds of shipments a day. It's not like they label them hero." Vernon turned to him, his blue eyes sharp but not unkind, carrying the weight of a man who'd seen too much to judge too quickly. "That's why I'm here, son," he said, a faint smile touching his lips, laced with the dry irony of age. "To make sure someone remembers who he was. You'd do well to remember that not everything fits on your clipboard." Lester's face flushed, and he looked away, his shoulders hunching under the weight of Vernon's words. The air in the cargo hold grew heavier, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of a jet engine outside. Vernon unfolded the flag with deliberate care, his hand steady despite the ache in his joints. He draped it over the casket, smoothing the fabric with a reverence that transformed the cold metal into something sacred. The stars and stripes gleamed under the dim lights, a silent promise kept. Before anyone could speak, a new sound pierced the quiet, a low guttural rumble, followed by the sharp screech of tires on asphalt. The cargo bay doors swung open, and 3 men in crisp army dress uniforms strode in, their polished boots clicking in unison against the concrete. The leader, a tall man with graying temples and a chest adorned with medals, carried an air of authority that filled the room. His name tag read Colonel Marcus Drayton, 3rd Infantry Regiment. His dark eyes swept the scene, taking in Vernon's uniform, the flag-draped casket, and the tense figures of Terrence and Lester. "Mr. Haskins," Marcus said, his voice firm but warm as he extended a hand. "I'm Colonel Drayton. We got a call from a passenger who saw what happened upstairs. I'm here to ensure Private Thornton's escort proceeds as it should." Vernon shook his hand, his grip steady despite his age. "Thank you, Colonel," he said, his voice carrying a quiet gratitude. "I appreciate you coming." Marcus's gaze shifted to Terrence and Lester, his expression hardening like steel cooling in a forge. "And I'd like to know why a tomb guard from Arlington was denied access to a fallen soldier's remains," he said, his tone cutting through the air. "Someone care to explain?" Terrence stepped forward, his posture rigid but respectful. "Sir, there was a mix-up with the airline's manifest," he said, his voice steady. "I've taken responsibility to escort Mr. Haskins to the cargo hold. It's being corrected now." Lester, however, shrank under Marcus's gaze, his clipboard now a flimsy shield. I was just following protocol," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "No one told me about an escort." Marcus's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Protocol?" he repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "You delayed a man who's dedicated his life to honoring this country's fallen. That's not protocol, son. That's a disgrace." Lester's face burned red, and he stared at the floor, unable to meet the colonel's gaze. Vernon remained silent, his focus on the casket, the flag now perfectly aligned. He didn't need to speak. The truth of his presence spoke louder than words. The soldiers behind Marcus stood at attention, their faces solemn, their uniforms a stark contrast to the utilitarian chaos of the cargo hold. Upstairs, in the gate area, the confrontation had sparked a fire. Marla Hensley, the passenger who'd recorded the earlier exchange, had posted her video online, and it was spreading like wildfire across social media. The hashtag #HonorTheFallen was already trending, with comments pouring in from veterans, families, and strangers moved by Vernon's stand. A small crowd had gathered outside the cargo bay doors, drawn by the sight of military vehicles parked on the tarmac. Aaliyah Brooks, the teenage girl who'd stood up for Vernon, was among them, her phone buzzing with notifications as she texted her friends about the scene unfolding. Inside the cargo hold, the doors opened again, and a woman in her 50s stepped through, her steps hesitant but purposeful. Her name was Denise Thornton, Jamal's mother, who'd flown in from Atlanta to meet her son's remains. Her face was etched with grief, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a plain black dress, her hands clutching a small photograph of Jamal in his uniform, his smile bright enough to light the world. When she saw Vernon standing by the casket, she froze, her breath catching. "Are you the one who fought for my boy?" she asked, her voice trembling but strong, like a river carving through stone. Vernon met her gaze, his own eyes softening with a shared understanding of loss. "I'm just doing my duty, ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady. "Your son deserves every honor we can give him. I'm here to make sure he gets it." Denise crossed the room in a few quick steps, her hands reaching for Vernon's. She grasped them tightly, her fingers trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Thank you for making sure my Jamal isn't alone." Vernon's throat tightened, but he held her gaze, his own eyes glistening. "He's not alone, ma'am," he said. "Not now. Not ever." Marcus cleared his throat, his voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Haskins, we'd be honored if you'd lead the escort to the plane. The regiment will follow your command." Vernon nodded, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. "I'd be proud to, sir." The soldiers snapped to attention as Vernon and Marcus organized the procession. The casket, now properly draped with the flag, was lifted with reverence, each movement precise and deliberate. Denise walked behind, her head high despite her grief, her hand still clutching Jamal's photograph. Terrence followed, his pilot's cap back on, his presence a silent show of respect. Lester lingered at the edge of the group, his clipboard forgotten, his face a mask of shame. As they emerged onto the tarmac, the late afternoon sun bathed the scene in golden light, the air sharp with the promise of dusk. The crowd outside had grown, a sea of faces stretching from the cargo bay to the terminal windows. Aaliyah stood at the front, her eyes bright with awe, her hands clasped together. She began to clap, a solitary sound that echoed across the tarmac. One by one, others joined her, passengers, airport staff, even a few TSA agents who'd stepped out to watch. The applause grew into a wave, a collective tribute to the soldier and the man who'd fought for him. Kendra Willis stood at the edge of the crowd, her face pale, her coffee long forgotten. Her supervisor had called her down, having seen Marla's video and the flood of comments demanding accountability. Kendra's eyes met Vernon's for a fleeting moment, and she looked away, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. She'd been so caught up in her own world, her deadlines, her manifest, her stress, that she'd forgotten what mattered. Now, the truth of her mistake was undeniable, and her job hung in the balance. Vernon didn't acknowledge her. His focus was on the casket, now being loaded onto the plane with the care it deserved. He stood at attention, his hand raised in a crisp salute, the soldiers behind him mirroring his gesture. Denise joined them, her own salute trembling but resolute, a mother's farewell to her son. The plane's cargo door closed with a soft thud, sealing Jamal's final journey. As the procession ended, Marcus turned to Vernon, his voice low. "Mr. Haskins, men like you are why we still have honor in this country. Thank you." Vernon shook his head, a faint smile touching his lips. "No, Colonel, thank you. You reminded these folks what it means to stand for something." He turned and walked back toward the terminal, his limp more pronounced now, the weight of the day settling into his bones. The crowd parted for him, their applause fading into a respectful silence. Aaliyah ran up, her eyes shining. "You did it, Mr. Haskins," she said, her voice bright with admiration. "You made sure he was honored." Vernon looked at her, his smile warm but weary. "We all did, young lady," he said, his voice tinged with that same dry humor. "Sometimes it just takes a few voices to wake folks up." As he disappeared into the terminal, the crowd dispersed, their phones buzzing with the story of the old soldier who'd stood his ground. Marla's video continued to spread, a testament to Vernon's quiet courage. Kendra and Lester faced their supervisors, their actions now under scrutiny. But for Vernon, none of that mattered. He'd done what he came to do. Private Jamal Thornton had been honored, and that was enough.